Good afternoon. My name is Leigh Mello, and I'm from Suffolk University Law School. And yes, I'm supposed to stay in this zone.
It's hard.
It's hard for legal speaking about speed dating today is particularly fitting because it was last year at the December 2010 New England Consortium of Legal Writing Teachers Conference hosted by BC Law, where I received the inspiration to try to implement a speed dating exercise in my classroom. So today in my 15 to 20 minutes, I hope to share with you the impetus for the exercise, the mechanics, the nuts and bolts of how it can be implemented, the possibilities, because several of my colleagues have also implemented speed dating exercises in different forms, the benefits as I've seen them so far, and also feedback from my students. So as far as what happened last year at the conference, if you weren't there, we had a panel, there was a panel of employers, government, there was a judge, I believe, private sector, public interest. And this panel of employers was there to tell us, legal writing faculty, what they saw, what they perceived to be weaknesses in new lawyers, their new employees, recent graduates. And one of the employers said something that struck me. He said that for even those students who could write well, even those students had difficulty with this task. They could not sit across the desk from him and succinctly answer these three questions. What is the case about? Is it good for us or bad for us? And why? And I was struck by that because speaking about law and legal analysis face to face with someone is a lot of what lawyers do. And yet I had to admit to myself at that moment that that is not something I give my students great opportunities for in the classroom, or at least I didn't. I don't think that it's the exact same experience. I think it's a very different experience for a student, especially on a sensory level, than when they simply raise their hand and answer a question with all eyes upon them. So mechanically speaking, speed dating is not very complicated, although it does take some preparation on your part. So this is on the back of the handout that you have or that you can actually get. I've divided the mechanics into two possible ways of using speed dating. This is the one I call Professor Designs Questions. So in January of 2010, after attending that conference, I decided to implement speed dating for the very purpose that I had learned about. And I told my students that I had attended this conference and heard about this perceived weakness in recent graduates in hopes that that would inspire them as they were undergoing the exercise to think that perhaps they were getting an opportunity to gain a skill that current new grads did not have. And so I brought in 6 note cards. At this point, the students were working on a persuasive memoranda. On each of the cards, I wrote one case name. I picked 6 core cases that both sides would be familiar with, the plaintiff and the defendants. I asked the plaintiffs to line up to sit down on one side of the table, defendants on the other. You may think that this person over here in the waiting area is siloed and how awful that might be, but I have to tell you, when I've had one class with an odd number of students and one with an even, they actually really like that. Because when I do speed dating, I do not allow them to haul their laptops down the row or bring their notes. It's their brain, their body, and whatever the challenge is before them on the note card. So that is, if they're lucky enough to be in the row with an odd number of students, that's their 5-minute reprieve where they can look back at their notes, refresh their memory, whatever. So here they would flip over the note card. I would tell them they would have 5 minutes. And for the first 5 minutes, the plaintiff's side, for example, would go first. And the plaintiff's counsel would look at the case and tell his or her partner, what's the case about? Is it good for us or bad for us, and why? And then I would ask the partner to give very brief feedback, both in the substance of what was presented, as well as on that person's ability to succinctly articulate his or her thoughts. Roles are then reversed within that same 5-minute time frame. Then it's a good time to inject some levity, so you're keeping track of the time. I use the good old hand on the big numbers so the students can follow along. I think other people use their fancy phones, which I don't have. Whatever you use. One of my favorite lines to say is, time's up, rate your date, move on. They love the rate your date comment. They always giggle and say something silly to one another. At this point, they shift. Now, so that my students can reach each station, as well as have a different partner, For this type of speed dating, I have the rows shift in opposite directions. So you can draw it on the board, you can tell plaintiffs, move away from the podium, defendants towards, whatever, they get the drift. Sometimes in the first 5-minute session, they haven't completed everything, but by then they get the sense of what 5 minutes is, and they usually do better as you move on. I was so excited after the first time I used this that I shared it with some colleagues, and then some of my colleagues implemented it in different ways, one of which was for peer review. So mechanically speaking, the only thing different for peer review is that the students are going to bring something with them. It's been used both in the first-year legal writing class as well as the advanced legal writing class, so perhaps they're bringing a statement of the issues, a draft question presented. And so if you're using this type of scenario, they're not set stations with a note card on the desk, and thus only one row needs to shift. Obviously, if you're doing a peer review, you want to guide them as to what type of feedback to give. Given the short time frame, I would recommend something very simple, such as identify one thing you think the writer did well and one thing you think the writer could work on and why. I do think the possibilities are endless. What I have here before you is just a list of what I know has been tried at Suffolk. The 3 questions refers to what I opened with. Another colleague had his students decide what case they wanted to talk about, and they would give the facts, the holding, the reasoning, and the relevance to their partner, and then the partner would do a different case. The second one here, explain possible weakness in prediction, was what I did very recently. The neat thing about speed dating is that I found that it can be used to address a problem. So this year, a different set of students, my students had they had completed the first draft of their objective predicting memo. They'd had an individual conference with me, they'd received their memos back, and were allegedly in the process of rewriting. So I found that this was the first-degree burglary problem, and despite the fact that my students were split probably 60-40 on those who felt that there was sufficient evidence versus those who felt that there wasn't, probably only half of my students successfully acknowledged the possible weakness in their prediction, okay, recognizing the other side. And so to me, this was a problem that needed to be addressed for the rewrite. And although I could work on it one-on-one with people with their feedback, I thought we could also work on it as a group. So I designed note cards in advance that set up specific challenges for students. One note card could be as simple as analogize your case facts to Farabee. Farabee's a case they're familiar with. Now, to some students, that was a huge challenge because in their mind, up to that point, they could only see their case as different from Farabee. So by going through this exercise with 6 different stations, the students were somewhat enlightened, not only by having to articulate something that they're being forced to articulate, but also to hear from other students, some of who did think that way the first time through, to recognize both sides of the issue. And I'm still grading the rewrites, but I have to say, every single one so far has at least, not always successfully, but it has at least tried to acknowledge the weakness in the prediction. So I saw that as successful. And then again, as I mentioned before, it's been used successfully by some colleagues of mine for peer review purposes. The benefits go way beyond what I first anticipated. Clearly, it does allow the students to engage in a real-world skill in that they are communicating face-to-face with another person about law, about their legal analysis. But to me, one of the most exciting things was the active engagement of all. That's the subtitle, everyone gets engaged. When you or I pose a question in the classroom, there are usually some students who raise their hand, they formulated an answer to your question, they're eager to deliver their answer. There are other students who will formulate an answer, they will think about raising their hand while they observe you in dialogue with those students who have already been called on. There are students who formulate an answer without any intention of raising their hand. And yes, we have students who are not even thinking about the question posed. So speed dating gets every single student to think and to speak again and again and again for a sustained 30 minutes. It really is active engagement of all. It also, interestingly, I realized, was giving students an opportunity for self-assessment. by going down the row with 6 of your peers and having this type of dialogue, one can only start to recognize where one's relative strengths and weaknesses are vis-a-vis your peers, whether that's on depth of analysis, ability to articulate clearly, mastery of the law, whatever it is, students start to see where they fit in with their peers, even preparation. The access to diverse feedback happens not only in the peer review type model where people are actually bringing in their documents to be reviewed. And in that case, I think it's often helpful to remind students that if you hear the same thing 3 times, whether it's a positive remark or a helpful criticism, you can probably anticipate that that is something that's accurate, which is probably helpful to students as opposed to the simple one-on-one peer review where they have to decide how much weight do I give to John's critique of my work. But the peer review and the diverse feedback also takes place in the other type of speed dating exercise because there's oral feedback given to you simply on your ability to articulate your thoughts. It enhances learning substantively, so whatever it is you're talking about, for example, the more recent one about recognizing weaknesses in your prediction, by working on this in a sustained manner for 30 minutes, I really do think the students got a lot more out of it than they would have sitting alone just reading my individual comments, thinking about how to improve upon this on their rewrite. And finally, it's fun. It really is fun, and I say this not just because it looks like my students are having fun, but I actually did survey them this year. So what I did was on my last day of class for the semester, I distributed an anonymous mid-year evaluation about all aspects of the course. And one of the questions, one of the open-ended questions that I included was the speed dating exercise helpful or not? Please explain. So I bring with me, and I'll start just as we start when we critique our students' work with a positive. I will start with a positive. But I bring with me the verbatim excerpts from these evaluations, those that are representative of all. It was helpful to see what it's like to have to talk face-to-face about issues. So clearly, I mean, this is something that's, if it's helpful to see what it's like, this is something that students were not doing or getting elsewhere, at least this particular student. It allowed me to see if I was able to verbalize my analysis. Now, this is one of those people that clearly like to think about the answer, but never voluntarily verbalizes his or her analysis. Next exercise of the course, I like that. I do like to do a lot of exercises, so I think that I take that to be a good compliment. It was a great way to gain perspective from others. Here's the peer review benefit. I thought it was very helpful, mainly due to seeing how classmates approached the cases and how they differed from my approach. Again, that's the self-assessment, the peer review benefit. Don't worry, I won't go on and on, but I will get to the negative on the next slide. It was definitely useful to have to articulate thoughts into words. It was more challenging than I thought it would be, and I loved it like that. So the negative feedback, of which there were 2 out of 30, both had to do with the same issue, which was the lack of advance notice of what they were going to be doing. So to me, this is a strategy call on your part. No, I did not tell my students to refresh their memory about the cases prior to doing this. And again, the students I surveyed were the ones that I did it for on helping them with their rewrite on the predictive memo. So they've written a memo, they've had an individual conference with me. I would have thought that they would know the cases by name. 2 apparently did not, and so it probably wasn't the most helpful exercise for them. But nonetheless, it's just something to keep in mind that whether or not to give advance notice when it's something other than a peer review exercise. So my contact information is here. It's on the handout. I will post the PowerPoint to Twen. I really would welcome hearing from anyone that tries speed dating in the classroom to know what purpose you used it for. If you add any personal touches that you think makes the exercise even more valuable for your students, please do share that with me.